Hello everybody, and welcome to the 8th in our Walk in My Shoes series for our members. I want to just start by saying a big thank you to those of you that have already attended one, that have come today, and those of you that are coming repeatedly to these sessions and getting involved in our talks. We now have had over 400 people register for this Walk in My Shoes series from 25 different countries. And we, Philanthropy Impact, are very pleased and proud to be able to provide this forum for discussion and knowledge sharing. It's what we are set up to do, so please remember to look at our website and to learn more about the training that we're offering online now, and get in touch with me directly to chat about how we could work more together. So, following on from the stark reality being reported by leading researchers in the sector, that we are looking at potentially losing 50% of charities in the UK alone, today, we are starting to discuss the role philanthropy can play in preventing charities from closing and how funders can adapt to support infrastructure and promote resilience during this time. I want to say a huge thank you to our panellists today, Cath Dovey, our chair and co-founder of the Beacon Collaborative, Helen Carter, director at Francis C. Scott Charitable Trust, and Suzanne Reisman, our member and principal at law offices of Suzanne M Reisman, and of course, our CEO, John Pepin. As usual, please remain respectful to the discussion and the panellists, and use the chat for questions. Join us on LinkedIn to carry on discussions after the call. The link was in your invitation for this call, but I'll also put it in the chat. And so now I'll hand back over to you and see if I can find Helen.
Many thanks, Sophia. While you find Helen, I'm just going to turn to our other two panellists just to get a little perspective on what they're seeing at the moment. Obviously, this whole COVID-19 episode is moving fast. Things seem to be changing on a daily basis. So, just a couple of quick questions to kick things off. Suzanne, topic today, the role of philanthropy to save charities and support infrastructure. How aware would you say your clients are of the challenges, in fact, the crisis that's currently facing the charity sector in the UK?
Thank you, Cath. I'm delighted to participate today. The response depends on who the clients are. I think that private foundations and grant makers and experienced philanthropists are far more familiar with the issue than some individual donors may be. That being said, I think, most everyone is aware of the devastation that's taking place in all parts of the economy, including the voluntary sector. But I think that giving to infrastructure has always been a less sexy, so to speak, part of philanthropy, and that institutional donors are more likely to appreciate the need for that. But word is spreading, and our society would be totally different without it. And I think one thing that advisors can do is to explain that to people when they're talking to them about the options with respect to their giving.
Thanks, Suzanne. And John, I don't know, would you be able to set the scene just a little bit on exactly what some of those challenges are that are facing the charity sector at the moment?
Well, I think there's a big issue. We have a lot of money now going out to charities who are doing direct service. There's still not enough because there's a whole issue of government and others, around 750 million available, but there's an estimate that the loss of income through this period is going to be over 4 billion. So there's a big issue about whether charities are going to survive. And I guess one of my concerns is that if it's a survival of the fittest, it should really be the survival of the ones who are having the greatest impact. And I don't think that's going to happen. The other aspect of this, I think, has got to do with professional advisors and how they are responding to this, because their clients are coming to them for help, and many of them aren't actually ready to support or see that as necessarily their role, although that is changing and starting to grow. So a big issue is, how do they respond to their clients? How do they help their clients?
And just picking up on that first point, John, around, within the sector, we are going to see a lot of charities that don't survive, and in your view, we should try to concentrate on those that are having the greatest impact. I mean, my sense is that the priority at the moment is service delivery. We've got needs amongst vulnerable groups and groups that weren't previously vulnerable, sort of spiraling upwards at the moment. and there's a lot of focus on service delivery. Do you have a sense from the Philanthropy Impact membership at all of just how broad and deep that challenge is becoming?
Sorry, you faded out there. Can you repeat the last part of what you were saying?
Sorry, do you get a sense from the Philanthropy Impact membership just how broad and deep the challenges are that are facing the charity sector?
I think they're quite deep, but what seems to be lacking, I think, is what's going to happen during recovery and after recovery. Because right now everyone's focused on the crisis, so there's lots of money being raised, lots of money being distributed. Still not enough, but at least there's a lot of very positive activity taking place. But in terms of again, going back to advisors, because the research that we've done in the past clearly indicates that the advisors can play a significant role in helping their clients down their donor journey. And so many of them are being asked by their clients to do so. I mean, Cath, you just finished some research that you did. Maybe you could talk a bit about that research and some of the implications of it. I didn't know I was going to turn the question back on you, did you?
Well, I mean, certainly some of the stats in the sector at the moment are quite frightening, with NCVO identifying a 4.3 billion gap in funding in the first 12 weeks of this crisis. That's simply down to the fact that the non-profit sector in the UK will not be able to carry out business as usual and raise funds as usual. So they're already facing this huge gap. The government has stepped forward with an emergency fund of 750 million. Putting that into context, that covers 19% of the suggested need. And there are many reports now coming out of organisations that are surveying their portfolio charities, with numbers varying between 40 and 70% saying that they may close in the next 12 months. I mean, it's quite, the numbers I think are quite stark in terms of the depth of the challenge that we're facing ahead of us. And I think, Suzanne, I mean, your comments, I think, speak to kind of two responses to this. One, among experienced funders, perhaps private clients who've been involved in giving before. And then I think there's a whole new group of funders who is perhaps coming forward for the first time in response to this, who are going to need a different kind of advice. Perhaps if we start, first of all, with the experienced funders, Suzanne, I mean, what are the sort of questions and responses that you're seeing amongst your client base, the ones who are more experienced in giving to charitable organisations?
Well, that breaks down into two groups, Cath. One is private foundations, private charitable trusts or companies, and the second is individuals. With respect to the foundations, there's a lot of work being done at the moment, or some charities are involved in repurposing grants. So, for example, if someone was going to be involved in a, on-the-ground project where, that doesn't lend itself to social distancing, perhaps that's not going to go forward. You have to look at how much money was spent so far. How could that grant be repurposed? Perhaps the organization actually needs infrastructure money as opposed to, right now. Will they be able to carry out the grant in the future? And that takes communication. I think from a charity's perspective, communication is key. As soon as there's an issue, they should go to their advisors, they should go to their funders and discuss it. With respect to individual donors, I find that they tend to be more focused on direct need right now, coming up with, I glanced at the comments, I saw someone said, are charities coming up with creative solutions? There are lots of creative solutions coming along right now. And funders are getting involved in some of them. I mean, the response varies, I think, by geography. But, throughout the world, there are creative solutions that people are coming up with. And, newer donors, I think sometimes, depending on who they are, sometimes they tend to, say, well, let's give to an established charity. Others will say, well, I think this is a really creative idea and that's motivated me to give in a way that I might not have before because of the urgency of the need.
Mm. And as an advisor, what would you say kind of the key elements of your response to those who are kind of looking at this challenge for the first time?
The challenge of giving or the challenge of funding infrastructure?
The challenge of giving effectively in these circumstances.
Well, I think to me, I think giving is very personal, and I think you have to meet your client where they are. You know, when the crisis first started, I had someone come to me for the first time who didn't come for philanthropy, and they were worth significant sums of money. And when I asked them if they had any charitable intent, they said no, not at this point in their lives. Which, you know, to people, you know, with our bent, you know, the people in, you know, on this call, sounds odd, doesn't it? You know, if you have more than people could spend in 3 generations and you don't think you want to think at all about philanthropy, you know, everyone has their own view. But you meet people where they are. Different people are motivated by different things. But I think you have to sort of guide people in the right direction. And there's some people that are very keen and might say, I've never done this before. I'm interested in funding X, or how do I find out more about Y? And it's you know, it's really collaborating with all of the people in our networks and putting the right client in touch with the right people. And, you know, sort of explaining to them, are they concerned about tax? Are they not concerned about tax? Are they, you know, just meeting them where they are is the most important thing that I think I could say. And then making sure that they have the appropriate advice to back up their goals.
Thank you, Susan. I can see in the comments box, a couple of people have been asking where the statistics come from that I was just talking about. So the 3 reports I would suggest you might want to look at. Charities Aid Foundation's doing a lot of research among charities. I think their numbers are in the high 40%. Of those that don't expect to continue to operate in the next 12 months. The Institute of Fundraising has also put out some data, and the Directory for Social Change has also put out some data, which I think was picked up by DCMS's committee last week, with the Directory for Social Change coming up with 70% of charities are not likely to survive a year. So there's quite wide-ranging estimates out there, but 50% seems to be roughly the bullseye. I think is the number that was sent out on the flyer for this call. John, I'd just like to turn to you for a moment on the other question that we're getting in the box. This question of innovation and the role of innovation, not just in this current phase. I think most people recognise we're coming out of an immediate emergency response into starting to think what our charitable sector might look like in the future, with an expectation that there'll be 2 phases. The sort of phase that Suzanne's talking about, where organisations adapt their service delivery, and then beyond that, a question about the kind of society that we want to build and the role that the charitable sector will play in that future society. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we prioritise the charities that we hope to see going forward in light of those sort of broader discussions that are taking place about what its role is within our society. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting because my experience when I was running charities was that during the recession, high inflation and stuff, that you could still innovate, create and grow your organization. But it means in some instances it's going to mean a change in the approach to running charities. And the other aspect of this is what role social investment will play in all this, because it's just not around philanthropy, but can social investment invest in new ideas and new supports? And to also look for innovation, look for the social entrepreneurs to reinforce and support them. And there's a philanthropist who I know who will come across an individual who has really great ideas, great ambition, and that person will just give them lots of money to fulfill it all around solving societal issues. So to a certain extent, the innovation occurs within the charities, within the social enterprises, but also with innovators who are funders and supporting that. So you have Isa Bosch, for example, who's developed a whole range of really interesting approaches to trust and involvement of the charities that she's funding. And you have other people who are venture philanthropists who are really good. So I think it's a number of key issues, not just from the charity side, but also from the funder side as well.
But isn't there a tension here? So if we take, for example, just one sector, the arts and culture sector, which has, been hugely hit by the fact that so many institutions, well, all institutions have had to close. Many of them had followed the guidance and started to diversify income streams so that they were, trading income from their cafes and bars and trading income from their seat sales. And actually going forward, they're likely to be particularly hard hit because those that are purely grant funded may have a group of funders around them who are de-restricting, who are enabling them to access funds that are not going to be available for those that have diversified their income streams. I mean, I do think that there is a big question here around how we support our third sector. And whether this message of diversifying income streams, as the only mantra going forward is actually going to be positive or negative, and whether we need to, really reassess from the ground up what good funding looks like for our charity sector, certainly for those that survive, because I think it's becoming clearer by the day that we're not going to have the same number of charities going forward that we've had in the past. Where do you see social investment playing in this new dynamic?
I think it could be, it's an important source of revenue. And with the current SITR tax benefits, which are to a certain extent better than gift aid for the individual social investor, I think there's lots of opportunity. There is a question of government, whether it's going to continue with SITR, so there's some issues that have to be addressed there. The other, I think, is government has played an interesting role in actually starting social investment in this country way back, and with the first grant investment opportunity that went to bridges. So 20,000 from government, 20 million from government, 20 million from city people. And so I think government now can play a pretty significant role in just not giving out grants, but also finding interesting ways to deliver service from a social entrepreneurial perspective. So I think it's going to cause people to have to change their behavior to a certain extent, and to a certain extent the culture of some of the charities. Grants are needed. It's really important to have grants, but also you can look at this other side as well. And you're right, those who have been very commercial are going to face a tough time commercially, but so is everyone else in the commercial sector. And so there are some grants available. You can go back to your investors, because I've talked to some who have basically said, we want to protect the investments we've made, so we're going to maybe come up with some grants or some other ways of dealing with it. So I think there's a number of key issues.
So that point around protecting the investment, I mean, one comment that I'm hearing a lot at the moment is, how do we determine which charities ought to survive going forward? And what I'm hearing from both of you is that experienced funders are considering the charities that we can't afford to lose, whether that's a social investment or whether that's a grant investment, but taking a really long, hard look at the portfolio and saying, how can we support all of these, and which organisations do we want to make sure survive going through this current crisis? Would you say, Suzanne, that kind of sums up where the grant funders are among your client base?
Not exactly, actually. I think it's more a question, with regard to individual funders. Yes, actually, they'll look at, what do I think is important, what don't I want to lose. With regard to institutional funders, I'm finding that, to the extent that they have ongoing commitments, these are ongoing commitments, their mission has been clear to them. And they want to make sure that those commitments are fulfilled and that the organizations that they're partnering with remain strong. Maybe it's semantic, but it's not a sense of, but I don't get a sense that they're trying to change the landscape. Mm-hmm. That being said, I have gotten some very sharp feedback from some individual social entrepreneurs about how this is a real opportunity to reshape society in general. And that, that this is an opportunity to look at social equality and reshape the way that, and shape the way we think about everything. Which, these people would not be alone. It's been a rallying cry for some time. But it's interesting to hear it from the social funders. And it's not that they're looking at social innovation as opposed to grants. I think they're looking at, you know, whether society, you know, society which put them in a position to be philanthropists, actually, you know, and to have, you know, the disposable assets to do this is really the way going forward. And I found that quite interesting because before the crisis, they were very comfortable with their position and helping those that they could help.
Interesting. Thanks, Suzanne. Helen, you're on mute, but it's really good to have you. We've been talking a bit about the landscape out there, the number of charities that are potentially facing closure, and really what funders can do, both as philanthropists and social investors, to support organisations through the crisis. I mean, obviously you're working in the northwest of England, very close to your local community. I'd just be very interested to hear from you, kind of what you're seeing on the ground, and you know, whether these big numbers that we're seeing, around half charities likely to fail, is that what's being played out in the community?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Hi. Sorry about the tech issues. I don't know what happened there, but it's good to be able to join you. Yeah, I confess I was a bit surprised to read this 50% forecast potentially of charity closures, and I don't know what that's based on. I was doing a little bit of looking through some figures I received from a survey up here of charity and community groups, and there are just over 40%. I don't know if it's based on reserves and financial position particularly, but in excess of 40% certainly have either none or up to 3 months worth of reserves. And so it's feasible, I suppose, to think that would put you into a very sharp predicament at the minute, particularly with the level of uncertainty in terms of how long this initial sort of crisis phase might last. Is it what we're hearing playing out on the ground? It's interesting, isn't it, when we talk about the sector as a whole, we forget, I think, often that actually the sector is so enormously nuanced, and that there is such a wide variety of organisations, and certainly what I'm seeing and hearing right now and over the last couple of months during this this whole scenario is the different ways that this is playing out. And so there isn't a one size fits all at all. So there's a large number of organisations, of course, who have an increase to their demands, both because they are directly supporting those affected in an individual direct sense from the health pandemic, and then there are those who are becoming now more so, their demand is increasing because of the secondary effects of the other restrictions on movement. So organisations working with mental well-being, with domestic violence, and increasingly with financial hardship in individual households and across communities. And so the effects on charities are not all the same. And then by contrast, you've also got some for whom their programmes perhaps are paused for a period of time, or they're struggling to engage with the sort of people that they would normally work with. So youth is a classic example in terms of the different sort of parallel experience that they're having. So whilst a lot of youth organisations are delivering online, remotely, digitally, that's probably across the board a little bit more patchy, and so it really depends on the nature of the organisation. A forecast is difficult to know, isn't it? Is it going to be 50%? I would hope not, but yeah, difficult to sort of to say across the board, just because the experiences are so different. And also, you know, the nature of charitable organisations is so different. You know, there are huge numbers of very, very small organisations who are largely volunteer run, who operate really on a shoestring, and whilst they might be reporting that they have no reserves, they might actually need very little to run over a long period of time. And so it's difficult, I think, to draw too firm a conclusion from some pretty high level stats.
Interesting. I mean, I'm hearing from you, Helen, and from you, Suzanne, you know, this issue of huge variation and variety, both across the charity sector and the responses among philanthropists and other donors to try and provide some support in this environment. I think it does raise a question around collaboration, and I see some questions coming in the chat as well around, you know, clarifying, if you will, what functions different kinds of funding can take, making sure that we have a much more coordinated approach so that we do make sure that there's a safety net in place for all organisations, not just those that shout the loudest or are the most visible. There's also a great question on here around clarifying the role of the state to provide frontline services so that philanthropists can fund strategic changes and new thinking. I mean, there's some really interesting ideas coming up here around how different streams of funding could be brought in to try and support this great need. It does raise a question around how you get leadership into those kinds of structures. And I think this plays to the other theme that we have today, which is looking at the support for infrastructure in giving to make sure that we can afford to get that coordination in place. I'm sure, Helen, in the region where you're operating, the local players will be well known, the collaboration will be almost natural. Are there any lessons that we can learn from that that perhaps we could apply on a national scale, do you think?
I think that's really, it's a really fascinating question, actually, and it's something that's been part of a conversation going on here, not least of all in response to a specific joint funding bid that went to the emergency grants panel up here recently, and one of the critical elements that made a collaborative bid possible was the presence of leadership, not in just the organisations who were applying actually, but in their key partnership with the local authority. And the comment was made that application could not have happened, that this collaborative approach could not have happened a year ago, because the particular leadership in other sectors as well as the charitable sector was not there previously. And I think it's such a and I don't know enough about the detail of that particular scenario to be able to say it looks like this or it looks like that, it looks like the other. But I think understanding that the cross-sector piece is absolutely critical. It's not that the charitable sector is incredibly diverse. It's a real tapestry, as is the funding picture, and I think that's incredibly important. There shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all, but I think really understanding how those sectors and subsectors fit together and where leadership comes from within that is quite fascinating and probably quite crucial.
Thanks, Helen. John, I can see we've just got a couple of minutes left. So from an advisor's perspective, funding into this patchwork, this complex landscape, where we're trying to engender some sort of collaboration, what resources can wealth advisors turn to? Or what role can they play in potentially supporting that collaboration and that coordination? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I mean, the Beacon Collaborative puts out a weekly guide and list of funders and funds and different things like that. So that's really a valuable piece of information. I would suggest people go to Beacon Collaborative website to start to get that on a regular basis. You can also find it on our website. The second thing is that I think there's a lot of training needed for professional advisors around how to deal with this. We provide training along these lines, which seems to be successful. But a third aspect of this, which hasn't been mentioned, is the role of fundraisers. I mean, fundraisers have a really difficult task these days to raise money in their organizations. But part of the issue and what we try to train them about is to treat their donors as clients and help them meet their needs. And if you don't do that, then it makes it more difficult to raise the money. So I think that there's issues around that as well. I mean, Suzanne has talked about her clients and meeting with their clients and helping to meet their needs. Well, fundraisers, revenue generators should do the same as well.
Thanks, John. So we have just literally a few seconds left. I don't know if any of the panelists have got any points that they would like to make just as we close this out. Suzanne, or anything from you?
No, I'll give the floor to anybody who wants to take it.
Helen, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just one thing actually to pick on as a point Suzanne was making just as I came into the call about social entrepreneurs in particular, sort of saying, well, you know, this question around social equity and equality, and again, a conversation that's happening up here in the last week is, you know, recognising as we talk about business as usual and going back to normal, well, actually, what was normal and business as usual before was not great for a lot of individuals and a lot of communities, and this is there is I think a growing conversation around what the future might be able to look like instead of, so not going back to what was normal or usual before, and I think that's quite an exciting innovation and a quite different prospect.
Thanks everyone. So I'm taking away from this a couple of key themes: the patchwork, the diversity in the challenge that we have in among our charitable sector, the challenge of connecting donors into that patchwork, and also how to develop a coordinated vision so that when we do renew, we have a society that is perhaps fairer and more supportive than the one that we've had in the past. Sophia, I don't know if you want to just close things out, but thank you very much to the panelists for joining us. It's been a very helpful and interesting conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Just to echo Cath, thank you all for joining us. There have been a couple of questions that haven't been able to be answered today, and they will be on the LinkedIn. Please, if you have a second panelist, go in and have a say if you have one there. And to Patricia, I'm very aware that yours is it's much bigger than this 30-minute topic right now. But yes, I'd love to talk to you offline about getting an event up and running around that very topic on racial inequity in philanthropy. Okay, thanks guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.